Hey guys, tonight we're delving into the eating habits of a legend, Alexander the Great. This was a man who conquered half the known world before his 33rd birthday, tamed wild horses as a teenager, founded cities with the casual ease of playing ancient SimCity, and still faced the daily question of what to have for breakfast. Was it tender roasted lamb in a golden bowl, humble boiled lentils in a battlefield tent, or simply whatever creature didn't manage to scurry away fast enough? Before we peek into his royal lunchbox, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I create here. And do let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always find it fascinating to see who's watching this at 2 a.m. while casually eating cereal straight from the box, much like a true war general. Now, dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that soft, calming hum, and let's gently ease into tonight's journey together. Before he became Alexander the Great, he was just Alexander hearing calls to eat your porridge. Long before his days of empire building, world conquest, and being mourned across 3 continents, young Alexander of Macedon began his mornings like any other noble boy, with a breakfast that was aggressively wholesome and suspiciously difficult to chew. Imagine a chilly Macedonian morning. The sun hasn't even risen yet, and neither has Aristotle, but the kitchen is already bustling with the sounds of barley boiling and people politely pretending it tastes better today. Breakfast for young Alexander likely consisted of boiled barley gruel, which is essentially a polite term for hot, slightly salty mush. Occasionally, it might have been elevated with a splash of goat's milk or, if it was a special occasion, a dried fig that looked like it had endured a rather traumatic experience. Alongside this steaming bowl of mild culinary disappointment, there would have been bread, probably made from emmer or barley flour, rough in texture and fundamentally opposed to any notion of fluffiness. It was the kind of bread that seemed to stare back at you, that held grudges, and that could easily serve as a blunt object during moments of political tension. Olives would also make an appearance because nothing says childhood breakfast quite like bitter, oily fruit soaked in brine. And if you were exceptionally fortunate, and by fortunate, I mean born into a royal bloodline with at least one surviving parent, you might receive a wedge of goat cheese, aged to the point of self-defense and capable of clearing your sinuses from across the entire room. To wash it all down? Why, yes, even for a child. But don't get too excited. It was heavily diluted, practically purple-tinted water. Macedonians believed that drinking pure wine was a habit reserved for barbarians and poets with questionable judgment. Sounds humble, and indeed it was. But this wasn't due to a lack of resources at the Macedonian court. No, Alexander's father, Philip II, deliberately raised his son in an environment of restraint. There were no luxuries, no softness, just essential calories, protein, and the psychological conditioning necessary for a man who would one day eat field rations in Persia without a single blink. So, forget golden pancakes or royal eggs Benedict. Instead, picture mush, olives, and bread so dense it could prop up a collapsing column. Breakfast, truly the first conquest of the day. Imagine sitting down for lunch, and across from you sits Aristotle, philosopher, scientist, and a perpetual dampener of excessive indulgence. You simply want to enjoy your barley bread and perhaps a fig, but he's there, mid-bite of lentil stew, delivering a mini lecture on the perils of overindulgence. As a teenager, Alexander wasn't just mastering swordplay. He was also rigorously trained in ethics, logic, rhetoric, and probably which foods might make him too lethargic to conquer Asia. Aristotle, a devoted student of Plato and a staunch advocate for balance in all aspects of life, took it upon himself to ensure that Alexander's body and mind were equally nourished, though likely not equally pleased. Meal times were viewed as opportunities for character development. If you dared to reach for a second piece of cheese, Aristotle would likely raise an eyebrow and casually remark on how gluttony dulls the soul and thickens the intellect. What fun! But this wasn't mere judgmental food shaming. Aristotle firmly believed that diet played a crucial role in shaping effective leaders. Too little food and you'd be weak. Too much and you'd become decadent. Somewhere in between, you might acquire an empire and maintain a strong physique. It's probable that Alexander learned the distinction between food as fuel and food as a display of vanity during these formative lessons. Simple legumes like lentils were considered beneficial for the soul, which is quite impressive given that they taste rather bland unless aggressively seasoned. Conversely, anything overly sweet, spicy, or luxurious was to be regarded with suspicion, as if it might corrupt one's morals and lead to a life of lounging in velvet by sunset. There's a certain irony in how food became such a significant educational tool. While most children were learning their alphabet by scratching letters into wax tablets, Alexander was likely being quizzed on Hippocrates' views on wine ratios and whether figs stimulated impure thoughts. This dietary philosophy remained with him even when Persian cuisine began to tempt him with its finest offerings. Despite the allure of lamb cooked in pomegranate glaze or rice so fragrant it ought to have been illegal, Alexander often adhered to the basics: bread, meat, and water, perhaps a few olives if he felt adventurous. So no, lunch with Aristotle was hardly enjoyable, but it was profoundly formative. Alexander didn't just learn how to conquer cities, he learned how to resist a second helping. And in ancient Macedon, that was considered true leadership. If you've ever lovingly packed a lunch with hope and exactly one slice of stale bread, congratulations. You might already qualify as a Macedonian field cook. The average midday meal in ancient Macedon wasn't about culinary delight. It was about avoiding collapse under the sun while bellowing military slogans. Alexander's daily lunch, particularly before his extensive campaigns, would have been characterized by extreme modesty. We're talking about a rough chunk of barley or emmer bread, hardened to the consistency of a ceramic tile. This was the kind of bread that required effort to chew, preferably with the aid of a dagger and a prayer. Accompanying this crunchy staple of the meal would be a few local provisions: goat cheese that traveled well but emitted an aroma that seemed ready to challenge you to a fight, and onions, which were practically a food group in Macedon. Onions were believed to enhance strength and endurance, and apparently, to facilitate unpleasant breath in diplomatic encounters. You might also receive a small pouch of dried figs or dates, depending on the season and whether the supply caravan had managed to avoid being plundered by wolves. These dried fruits were the ancient world's version of dessert: chewy, sticky, and possessing a texture somewhere between worn leather and bitter regret. For protein, there might be salted or dried meat, typically goat or beef, occasionally boar if they had recently raided someone important. It wasn't succulent or tender. It was the kind of meat that dared you to choke on it and prevail. And what did they drink? If they were lucky, diluted wine. If not, lukewarm water from a leather flask, which had likely spent most of the day steeping in sweat and saddle dust. How refreshing. Crucially, it's worth noting that Alexander ate the very same food as his soldiers. He didn't request exotic spices or demand grapes peeled by hand. No, he would sit in the dirt, tear off a piece of rock-hard bread, and chew with the determination of a man trying to inspire an entire empire with his jaw strength alone. So, when we discuss the Macedonian lunchbox, don't envision a charming bento set. Instead, picture a burlap pouch containing just enough calories to keep you alive, and that resented you just enough to motivate your survival. Functional, brutal, much like Alexander himself. Dinner with your father is inherently a tense occasion when you're a teenager. Now, imagine your father is King Philip II of Macedon, a man who skillfully juggled diplomacy, warfare, and at least 7 wives as if it were a competitive sport. Welcome to mealtime at the royal table, where the food was warm and the conversations could easily lead to exile. Philip's dinners were likely grand by Macedonian standards, yet still a far cry from the notorious Roman-style gluttony. Thick roasted meats, stews rich with lentils, boiled grains, and a jug of wine that had seen things. The king was famously fond of his drink. Historical sources politely describe him as a heavy drinker. That's ancient biographer speak for, "Your dad's drunk again." Alexander, on the other hand, often abstained or drank sparingly, not because he disliked wine, but because Philip had a habit of mixing complex politics with his Pinot, and young Alexander was already strategically navigating around him like a miniature general. Nothing quite ruins your appetite like watching your father negotiate a military alliance between bites of charred lamb. And the conversation? Intense. You'd have military advisors vehemently debating borders, poets reciting verses between gulps of stew, and philosophers casually insulting each other in ancient Greek. All the while, Alexander would quietly consume his cheese and meticulously plot how to eventually outconquer his father, which, by the way, he absolutely did. Occasionally, Philip would bring back exotic ingredients or dishes from other parts of the Greek world. Spiced fish, honeyed pastries, or strange herbs that caused a pleasant tingling on your tongue. Alexander sampled them, making polite comments, but he consistently returned to the basics. Bread, meat, and wine, foods that were solid, predictable, and eminently useful for building an empire. The emotional dynamic of these dinners? Let's just say that therapy hadn't been invented yet. Philip was both a role model and a raging migraine in sandals. Their relationship was a complex blend of love and gladiatorial combat. During one particular dinner, Alexander even stormed out after Philip drunkenly insulted him. That's how strained the atmosphere could be. And this was all before someone attempted to assassinate Philip with a spear. So yes, dinner with Dad was profoundly formative. It sharpened Alexander's political instincts, toughened his resolve, and likely instilled in him a lifelong preference for quiet meals with fewer risks of being stabbed. Now, let's talk about Alexander on campaign. Not just any road, but the kind that stretches through scorching deserts, bone-chilling mountain passes, and occasionally over the smoldering remains of your defeated enemies. What's on the menu for lunch on this picturesque route? A delightful serving of sheer desperation with a side of tactical nutrition. Field rations in Alexander's army weren't designed for culinary pleasure. They were created for survival, mobility, and, ideally, not causing death mid-march. Imagine a linen pouch filled with barley bread, onions, and dried meat. Ingredients that were highly travel-friendly, seemingly immortal, and borderline unpleasant in texture. The bread? It was dense, hard, and utterly unflavored. If you could chew through it without breaking a tooth, congratulations, you were deemed fit for military service. These loaves served multiple purposes. They doubled as utensils, makeshift shields, and in extreme cases, objects for emotional support. Reheated over a campfire, they could almost be considered edible. Eaten cold, you'd sooner bite a rock. Meat, if it was available, was salted beyond recognition. Goat, lamb, or beef, thinly sliced, left to dry in the sun, and salted until it became more mineral than muscle. This wasn't jerky. This was ancient dental testing material. It preserved well, though, and if you soaked it long enough in water or wine, it might even become pliable. Onions and garlic were constant companions. Not because they were enjoyable, but because they were cheap, pungent, and believed to boost stamina. Nothing quite signals, "I'm ready for battle," like breath so intense it clears an entire phalanx. For hydration, there was diluted wine. Not enough to induce drunkenness, but just enough to make the water taste less like saddle leather and regret. Straight water was rarely safe, especially when you were 700 miles deep into Persia and the local streams were actively being cursed. There were exceptions, of course. Occasionally, after a significant victory, Alexander would permit a grand feast. Roasted animals, flatbreads with herbs, and wine that didn't taste like boiled sandals. But such occasions were rare and invariably followed by another brutal march. It was never about luxury for its own sake. It was a reward, always with a built-in return to the harsh realities of campaigning. So yes, field rations were certainly not gourmet, but they kept you alive, alert, and just angry enough to take on the next empire. And Alexander? He ate the exact same thing. Not because he was forced to, but because he believed no man in his army deserved better food than his soldiers. Imagine this. You've been marching for days through blistering heat. Your sandals feel like useless leather remnants, and your throat feels as if it's been personally cursed by the sun god Helios. Suddenly, a soldier discovers a meager puddle. Not a spring, not a flowing stream, just a muddy, probably frog-adjacent puddle, and scoops the water into his helmet. Now, here comes the historical moment. That soldier humbly offers it to Alexander, the king of kings, slayer of Persian armies, conqueror of worlds. And Alexander simply looks at the water, thanks the man, and then pours it onto the ground in front of everyone. It's one of the most iconic and dramatically parched moments of Alexander's life. Not because of what he drank, but because of what he deliberately chose not to drink. But let's pause. Why a helmet? Because in the ancient world, specialized cookware was optional, but helmets were standard issue. Your helmet was your drinking cup, your bowl, your head protection, and occasionally your emergency chamber pot. Multifunctional, efficient, and slightly unsanitary. Alexander's gesture wasn't about personal hydration. It was a masterful performance art, with the morale of his army as the ultimate target. If he, the most powerful man alive, was not going to drink until everyone had water, then you, the weary foot soldier with sunburn and trench foot, could certainly endure as well. Was the water safe? Probably not. Ancient armies certainly didn't possess Brita filters. But that wasn't the crucial point. In one smooth, deliberate motion, Alexander transformed dehydration into a powerful team-building exercise. It was like a corporate trust fall, but significantly dustier and involving more sandals. And the legend persisted. Writers like Arrian and Plutarch couldn't get enough of this anecdote. Because here was a leader who didn't just command through strategic brilliance. He led through meticulously staged suffering. He was hungry when his men were hungry. He walked when they walked. And when the only available water looked like it had been scooped from a donkey's hoof print, he still refused to drink before his men. It's truly genius. Anyone can share a lavish feast. But deliberately choosing not to drink when others suffer? That's powerful emotional warfare. So the next time you sip bottled water and perhaps complain that it's not cold enough, remember Alexander, who once looked at a helmet brimming with lukewarm frog soup and declared, "No thanks, I'll wait," and his army revered him for it. Conquering an empire comes with its perks. One of the most enjoyable, significant food upgrades. When Alexander marched into Persia, he wasn't just met by trembling nobles and abandoned palaces. He was greeted by banquets so lavish they made Macedonian bread seem like gravel served on a napkin. Persian cuisine was serious business. These were the people who gave the world exquisite rice pilaf, succulent saffron-stewed lamb with pomegranate reduction, and approximately 47 types of sweets that all sounded vaguely like honey brick. Their royal banquets were architectural masterpieces. Gleaming gold dishes, crystal pitchers, exotic fruits piled high like miniature pyramids, and enough roasted meats to startle a small forest. And then there's Alexander, king of humble porridge and philosophical restraint, stepping into this culinary fever dream. It was like placing a Spartan inside a modern gourmet supermarket. Did he indulge? Sometimes. Historical sources suggest he did sample the saffron rice, the date-filled pastries, and the wine so potent it seemed to require its own map. But overall, he maintained a surprisingly modest diet. He still preferred simple bread, meat, and water over any jeweled stew or gold-dusted figure. This wasn't merely personal preference. It was a deliberate statement. To Alexander, excessive indulgence signified weakness, and in his worldview, weakness inevitably led to the loss of empires. So while Persian nobles reclined on silk cushions, delicately biting into stuffed quail, Alexander likely continued to chew on his trusty barley biscuit, probably wishing it possessed a bit more existential resolve. He did, however, allow his men to fully enjoy the spoils. After years of dust and boiled goat, they deserved a night or 12 of unrestrained feasting. Roasted lamb, grilled fish, honey cakes, all served on dishes so ornate they probably had their own intricate inheritance plans. But Alexander himself remained cautious. He had observed what happened to leaders who allowed luxury to take too deep a root. A soft belly, he believed, made for a poor shield on the battlefield. That said, he wasn't completely immune to new flavors. A few Persian ingredients, such as rose water and cinnamon, reportedly found their way into his meals. Flavor, after all, was not an act of treason. So yes, Persia presented a magnificent buffet, and Alexander sampled it. But in the end, he still dined like a man with vast deserts to cross, formidable enemies to pursue, and a deep, ingrained distrust of anything that sparkled unnecessarily on a plate. Alexander never actually shared a meal with Darius III in the traditional sense, but he definitely sat down to dinner because of him. After relentlessly pursuing the Persian king across Asia like the world's most determined food delivery person, Alexander eventually inherited more than just Darius's throne. He inherited his entire elaborate dining setup. We're talking about a royal kitchen operation on an entirely different scale. Darius didn't travel with just a few cooks and a pot. He traveled with hundreds of chefs, skilled bakers, spice handlers, and professional food testers whose job was essentially, taste this, just in case it's intended to kill the king. It was less of a military camp and more of a Michelin-starred mobile culinary convoy. When Darius fled and abruptly abandoned his dining tent, Alexander entered a world of sheer decadence previously reserved for mythological immortals and individuals with extremely fragile egos. There were gold-plated dishes, tables groaning under the weight of slow-roasted lamb, fragrant saffron rice, grilled fish wrapped in delicate fig leaves, and sauces that had been aged longer than most Macedonian soldiers. How did Alexander react? Well, like a man raised on onions and deep skepticism, he sat bolt upright, reportedly ignored the luxurious couches, and ate quietly while everyone else around him reclined uncomfortably, attempting not to make eye contact with the intensely focused conqueror. No slouching, no lounging, just purposeful chewing and perhaps a silent judgment. This wasn't rudeness. It was a deliberate signal. Alexander was not about to be seen indulging in Persian prince cosplay. He wanted everyone, especially the former Persian nobles now awkwardly pledging their loyalty, to understand that he remained fundamentally Macedonian, still disciplined, and perfectly capable of overturning the entire table if things became too soft. However, let's not pretend he didn't appreciate the culinary variety. Historical sources indicate that Alexander did adopt some Persian dining customs, such as multi-course meals and the occasional floral-scented wine. He wasn't above appreciating good food. He was simply above needing it to define him. So no, he didn't dine with Darius in the traditional sense, but he dined in Darius's very own seat, using Darius's silverware, surrounded by Darius's terrified chefs, which, in a way, was perhaps even more satisfying. After all, revenge is a dish best served on a gold platter, accompanied by a side of roasted goat and complete political domination. Alexander the Great was renowned for many things: his tactical brilliance, his unstoppable ambition, and achieving world domination before the age of 33. But tonight's focus, wine. So much wine. Enough wine to make even Dionysus pause and suggest, "Hey, perhaps pace yourself." Despite his usual personal restraint, there were moments, rare, dramatically theatrical, and often slightly tragic, when Alexander fully embraced the goblet. The most infamous of these incidents occurred in Persepolis, when the conquering hero, surrounded by immense luxury and an abundance of eager yes-men, hosted a massive, flamboyantly indulgent banquet. What was served? Likely an overwhelming spread of exquisite Persian delicacies. Succulent roasted lamb, fragrant rice pilafs, spiced fruits, sweet date syrups, and wine poured as if it owed someone a substantial debt. There were numerous toasts. Lengthy ones, emotional ones, and quite possibly some involving dramatic recitations of Homeric verse and weeping over Achilles. Then came the infamous incident. After many rounds of increasingly blurry diplomacy, Alexander, reportedly inebriated yet still regal, decided to burn down the magnificent royal palace at Persepolis. Why? Historians continue to debate this. Some suggest it was a symbolic act. Others believe it was an act of vengeance. A few even suspect it was a drunken dare, incited by his equally intoxicated companions. You know how it goes. A little too much fermented grape juice and suddenly you're torching a world wonder. Alexander awoke with the ancient equivalent of a monumental hangover and a slightly charred empire. It may very well be the first recorded instance of post-wine regret in military history. This wasn't an isolated case of inebriated leadership. Other accounts mention violent disputes erupting after banquets, including one tragic evening when Alexander, in a fit of drunken rage, murdered his close friend Clitus, the very man who had once saved his life in battle. That particular night concluded with vomiting, tears, and a crisis of existential proportions. Just your average Friday in Babylon. The key takeaway: for a man so meticulously obsessed with control, alcohol proved to be his single significant blind spot. And the more success he achieved, the more challenging it became to prevent the wine and the constant affirmations of his sycophants from overflowing. So yes, Alexander drank occasionally to excess. And when he did, he was no longer a king or a god. He was simply a very drunk man with a very poor sense of scale and, unfortunately, direct access to torches. Marching into India was not merely a geopolitical maneuver. It presented a significant culinary challenge for Alexander and his exhausted, flatbread-fed troops. They had traversed scorching deserts and trudged through freezing mountain passes. And now here they were, confronted by spices they couldn't pronounce and animals that resembled siege towers with tusks. Food-wise, India was a genuine revelation. This was a land rich with lentils, rice, ginger, turmeric, tamarind, and enough chili-adjacent heat to transform a Macedonian soldier's helmet into a makeshift steam room. Ancient sources, though somewhat vague and clearly dazzled, describe how the army encountered entirely new flavors. Complex curries, wonderfully fragrant stews, and vegetables that weren't just boiled until devoid of all character. Alexander reportedly embraced it. Despite his usual preference for simplicity, he was inherently curious, adaptable, and just self-aware enough to understand that you don't insult local cuisine while you are still, technically, invading. He sampled their food, and he respected their traditions. He did not, however, attempt to learn how to cook. That remained strictly someone else's responsibility. His men, on the other hand, did not adjust with quite the same grace. Macedonian soldiers were accustomed to meat, bread, and a healthy dose of grumpiness. Spiced lentils and strange fruits were met with deep suspicion or, in some instances, public complaints loud enough to startle elephants. Rumor suggests many soldiers began to miss their familiar barley stew, if one can even refer to barley stew as good. Then came the elephants, not as dinner, mind you, but as formidable battlefield opponents. Alexander, ever the pragmatist, probably took one look at a war elephant and instantly declared, "Okay, we're not eating that, but we're definitely recruiting a few." Still, Indian hospitality came with tables laden with richly flavored dishes. Goats simmered in aromatic spices, various fried doughs, and sweet date desserts. Even if Alexander limited himself to small portions, he couldn't ignore the overwhelming generosity. In fact, some reports claim he sent food back to his troops as a morale booster, which is ancient general speak for, "Here, try this and stop complaining." Ultimately, India expanded more than just the empire's borders. It expanded their taste buds, their tolerance for spice, and their emergency bathroom planning. And for a man who had once considered a salted onion a suitable lunch, this was indeed a significant culinary evolution. You can conquer Persia, march through Egypt, cross into India, and dine with kings, but eventually, the lentil always finds its way back to you. For Alexander, no matter how far he ventured or how many golden feasts were laid before him, he consistently returned to the culinary equivalent of a shrug: boiled lentils. Humble, utterly unpretentious, and possessing a texture somewhere between mushy gravel and warm skepticism, lentils served as his steadfast dietary North Star. Now, was this because he genuinely loved lentils? Probably not. No child dreams of one day ruling the world while munching on lukewarm legumes. But lentils were eminently practical, highly nutritious, and most importantly, politically neutral. They didn't scream luxury, didn't incite envy, and certainly didn't cause diplomatic incidents. They were simply there, like comfortable sandals or your most loyal but somewhat boring advisor. In a world of exotic foods and potentially dangerous banquets, lentils offered a safe culinary haven. They didn't originate from suspicious sources, nor did they require complex translation. And they most certainly did not lead to palace arson, as documented in the Wine Chapter 9. For a ruler who habitually slept with a dagger under his pillow, this was truly ideal cuisine. Historically, lentils had long been a fundamental staple in the Greek and Macedonian diet. Rich in protein, easy to store, and simple to cook with just a pot, a fire, and low expectations. Add a little vinegar or oil, perhaps some crushed garlic if you felt adventurous, and voila, you had the ancient version of, "I'm too tired to cook." Some sources even suggest that in Babylon, despite having access to every imaginable spice, roast, and delicacy, Alexander still requested simple meals, and lentils, of course, were always on that short list. It wasn't a form of self-punishment. It was a philosophical statement. a quiet nod to discipline and perhaps a subtle display of power. I could indulge in honeyed quail wrapped in gold leaf, but I choose humble, mushy brown pulses. It's also highly probable that lentils evoked a sense of home, reminding him of his training in the Macedonian hills, of dinners with Aristotle where food came with moral lessons, and of military camps where the only constant was the sound of chewing something slightly tragic. So yes, the lentil made its return, not with a grand fanfare, but with a quiet plop into a wooden bowl, and Alexander, emperor of half the known world, simply picked up his spoon and ate. Because even greatness, it seems, requires fiber. When you envision royal snacks, you might picture grapes meticulously peeled by trembling servants or delicate pastries served on gleaming silver trays while a harpist plays something emotionally intricate in the background. But for Alexander the Great, snacking was far less cinematic. Most of the time, snacks were consumed while riding horseback, overseeing a siege, or casually redrawing the very boundaries of the known world. Thus, convenience was paramount. A snack's desirability was measured not by its flavor, but by its ability to survive being tossed into a saddlebag, inadvertently stepped on by a horse, and still remain technically edible. Enter dried figs, olives, roasted chickpeas, nuts, and sturdy hunks of aged goat cheese so firm they could genuinely double as projectiles. These were the ancient world's equivalent of granola bars. Compact, rugged, and utterly devoid of emotional complexity. Dried figs were a particular favorite, portable, sticky, and bursting with natural sugars and energy. They provided Alexander with a quick burst of stamina, which proved incredibly useful when he was in the midst of conquering cities before lunchtime. Olives were salty, oily, and famously prone to staining your tunic at inconvenient diplomatic moments. But hey, electrolytes, roasted chickpeas, meanwhile, served as the popcorn of antiquity. Crunchy, satisfying, and plentiful, though tragically unbuttered. And nuts, especially almonds and walnuts, offered essential protein, healthy fats, and something satisfying to chew on while contemplating whether to cross yet another formidable mountain range. Alexander's commanders likely carried similar provisions, sometimes wrapped in cloth or stored in small leather pouches. No Tupperware, no airtight bags, just dust-covered finger food passed around between intense sword fights. And of course, there was always a pervasive layer of road dust, not intentionally consumed, but practically unavoidable. Everything acquired a fine coating of it. The bread, the meat, the figs. There's a practical reason why ancient armies tended to be lean. They were constantly chewing on sand and pretending it was a savory seasoning. Some accounts even suggest that Alexander, despite having access to far finer things, often chose to eat just like his soldiers. He did not wish to appear distant or pampered, and casually snacking on goat cheese while perched on a rock alongside your men? That, my friends, is ancient military relatability 101. So no, royal snacks were never decadent. They were durable, remarkably functional, and primarily flavored by their environment, which for Alexander tasted distinctly of ambition, road grime, and the occasional sweet fig. Every empire experiences its moments of culinary excess, and Alexander's conquests were certainly no exception. While his daily meals were often practical and ascetic, there were intermittent banquets, particularly after significant victories, where things became decidedly peculiar. Not past the salt, peculiar, more like, is that a fire-breathing dancer over there? Peculiar. Victory feasts were a blend of diplomatic theater and caloric indulgence. You'd observe Persian nobles trying desperately not to weep into their golden napkins, Macedonian soldiers wondering if honeyed lizard was some sort of cruel joke, and Alexander himself seated at the head of the table, attempting to prevent the entire affair from descending into interpretive, wine-fueled warfare. These lavish banquets were laden with roasted animals too large for a single table, enormous bowls of pomegranate-drenched rice, pastries intricately shaped like birds, and wine poured in seemingly endless streams. There were also live performances, captivating music, eloquent poetry recitations, agile acrobats, and possibly even an elephant or two performing something symbolic and vaguely intimidating. But the true chaos invariably erupted with the toasts. In Macedonian tradition, drinking wasn't just encouraged. It was practically a competitive sport, a form of weaponized revelry. Men would attempt to outtoast one another in sheer volume of wine consumed and the emotional intensity of their monologues. It would typically begin with a simple, "To Alexander," and conclude with someone shouting, "I would gladly die for your sandals," while passionately weeping into a leg of lamb. One of the most famous banquets that veered completely off course occurred in Samarkand, where Alexander attempted to merge Macedonian and Persian traditions by having both peoples feast together as equals. A noble idea, certainly, but a logistical nightmare. Language barriers, profound cultural misunderstandings, and the stark reality that Persian cuisine embraced complex sauces while Macedonian cuisine considered mere salt and indulgence. It was almost inevitably destined to end with someone overturning a platter. Sometimes the strangeness was entirely unintentional, such as when Alexander hosted a banquet in a recently conquered city that still faintly smelled of smoke. Or when people brought extravagant tribute dishes. Live peacocks, allegedly honey-glazed camel, or a pudding so complex it required 6 servants and divine patience to prepare. These feasts were far more than just meals. They were powerful political statements, elaborate unity stunts, crucial morale boosters, and occasional unforgettable lessons in why you should never allow the person from Thrace too close to the wine amphora. So yes, Alexander was capable of throwing a truly memorable party. But even then, he often ate sparingly, drank carefully, and observed everything with the keen eye of a man who knew history was always taking detailed notes. By the time Alexander reached Babylon, he wasn't just a king. He was a global phenomenon, with a diet that now incorporated elements from Greece, Persia, India, and whatever peculiar roasted thing they consumed in Bactria. Babylon, of course, rolled out the proverbial red carpet, and by red carpet, we mean feasts so extravagant they made Olympic opening ceremonies look like mere potlucks. This was truly the culinary climax of his extraordinary journey. Babylonian chefs were undisputed masters of opulence. They had access to succulent grain-fed lamb, richly spiced date wine, exquisitely cooked fruits, and an endless array of sauces, all served with immense flair and typically on solid gold dishes. Meals unfolded in multiple courses, accompanied by live music, fragrant incense, and the faint, intoxicating scent of either glory or profound exhaustion, perhaps both. Alexander's dining table had now become a major geopolitical event, with Persian satraps, Indian emissaries, Greek generals, and probably a philosopher or two awkwardly pretending they weren't deeply uncomfortable with the smell of cumin, all seated beside him. Yet, despite the overwhelming spectacle, Alexander still maintained his simple eating habits most of the time. He did not gorge himself. He did not lavishly drape himself in honey. He adhered to his old routines. Plain bread, meat, perhaps a little wine, even as peacocks stuffed with dates were paraded majestically by. This was part discipline, part shrewd political messaging. Yes, I rule the world, but I'm still humble enough to chew jerky like a common field grunt. And then came the final feast. Accounts vary wildly, as ancient historians were not exactly known for rigorous fact-checking. But most agree Alexander attended a massive banquet, possibly in honor of a deity, a close friend, or simply for successfully surviving yet another Thursday. There was food, and there was an abundance of wine. And sometime afterward, he fell gravely ill. Was it poisoning? A sudden fever? Malaria? Liver failure resulting from years of high-functioning world domination? We will never truly know. What we do know is that for 11 agonizing days, Alexander lay bedridden, unable to speak, eat, or even rise. The man who had seemingly consumed entire continents could barely sip water. There is no detailed record of his very last meal. It was probably not a grand affair. It might have been nothing more than a simple cup of wine or just a damp cloth pressed to his parched lips. In the end, the conqueror of empires departed the world in the same manner as all mortals. Quietly, humbly, and quite possibly hungry. So ended the feasting. So ended the man. And in Babylon, the banquet tables were cleared, and history solemnly took its seat. Let's imagine, for a moment, that Alexander the Great somehow stumbled into our modern world. His dusty cape draped, sword at his side, a little disoriented by escalators, and found himself standing in line at a bustling food court. What would he choose to order? Let's be clear, Alexander was not a man for frivolous choices. He did not suffer from indecision, and he certainly wouldn't believe in the concept of build your own bowl. He'd quickly scan the myriad options. Fusion tacos, vibrant rainbow smoothies, deep-fried everything, and he would likely settle on something straightforward, portable, and rich in protein. He'd bypass the sugar-crusted trend foods and probably head directly for a lamb gyro, nodding approvingly at the sight of the roast meat spinning like a miniature war chariot. Barley-based energy bars? Familiar territory. Lentil soup? A nostalgic favorite. Grilled onions? Yes, but only if the pungent smell reminded him of past conquests and occasional poor impulse control. Fast food would undoubtedly puzzle him, but its military-like efficiency might ultimately win him over. The notion of food being ready in under 2 minutes would have seemed like outright sorcery in Macedon, though he'd probably demand to inspect the kitchen and perhaps even attempt to conquer it. If forced to navigate a modern menu, he'd have pertinent questions. Why is this called a Caesar salad? Was he not stabbed in the forum? Why is this chicken general so? What army did he command? And upon tasting a milkshake, this is delightful. What animal did you milk to extract such sweetness? Health-wise, he'd probably thrive. His original diet, light on carbohydrates, heavy on walking 20 miles before breakfast, was already influencer-approved. Paleo? He essentially invented it. Keto? That's just a standard campaign season. Yet even with all this modern novelty, it's highly probable Alexander would still yearn for simplicity. A plain flatbread, some roasted meat, a cup of wine, diluted, of course, because he was no barbarian. No glittery cupcakes, no avocado toast, and most definitely no food served in a mason jar. Why? Because Alexander was not merely a man of appetite. He was fundamentally a man of profound purpose. Food served as fuel, a practical tool. Occasionally, it was a morale booster, but never the main event itself. So, if you ever find yourself struggling with indecision over what to order, simply ask yourself, would Alexander eat this or would he choose to annex it? And suddenly, that humble lentil wrap might not seem so boring after all. In the fading light of the ancient world, when the Mediterranean's greatest minds still gathered beneath grand colonnades and debated the very nature of the cosmos, a woman named Hypatia stood at the epicenter of this intellectual ferment. Born around 360 CE in the vibrant, intellectual melting pot of Alexandria, she was not, according to the prevailing customs of her time, destined to lead. Yet there she was, not merely participating in the realms of philosophy and science, but excelling far beyond her peers. Her father, Theon, was a highly respected mathematician and philosopher associated with the renowned Museum of Alexandria, a center of learning that still faintly echoed the fading legacy of the once mighty library. But while most fathers trained their sons in reading and horsemanship, Theon devoted himself entirely to his daughter's education. He meticulously tutored Hypatia in arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and Platonic philosophy. She didn't merely memorize theories. She challenged them, debated their intricacies, and passionately taught them to others. By the time she reached adulthood, Hypatia had surpassed her father in both intellectual prowess and influence. Her captivating lectures attracted students from across the entire Roman Empire, pagans, Christians, skeptics, and zealots alike. She taught openly in the city's bustling streets and revered lecture halls, wrapped in her distinctive philosopher's cloak, commanding attention not through authoritarian power but through the sheer clarity of her thought. She explained celestial motion, intricate conic sections, and the fundamental properties of numbers with such brilliant eloquence that people described her as nearly divine. And this was no cloistered scholar hidden away in dusty, secluded rooms. Hypatia moved freely and confidently through the male-dominated world of late Roman Egypt, offering wise counsel to city officials and even Roman governors. She embodied the values of the old world, the classical world, a world that was rapidly slipping away beneath the powerful tides of religious transformation and imperial instability. But Alexandria was no longer just a city of books and learning. It had also become a dangerous battleground of faiths. Christianity was rapidly rising, paganism was decisively waning, and politics had become far more perilous than any complex mathematical equation. Hypatia's growing fame, her fierce independence, and her symbolic status as a beacon of rational, classical thought began to stir deep envy and bitter resentment among those who prioritized divine revelation over human reason. Still, in those early years, she remained seemingly untouchable. Hypatia represented the final, brilliant light of a fading era, a woman revered not because she conformed to the world of men, but because she rose far, far above it. In an era when women were strictly expected to marry, bear children, and remain far from academic lecture halls, Hypatia made a profoundly subversive choice. She dedicated her life to intellectual pursuits, and, perhaps even more importantly, Alexandria, to some extent, allowed her to do so. Her presence was undeniably radical, but her sheer intellect made it incredibly difficult to dispute her authority. Hypatia didn't have to claw her way into intellectual circles. She was actively invited and sought out. Her masterful command of mathematics and astronomy placed her at the very forefront of Neoplatonism, a philosophical movement that skillfully blended the teachings of Plato with elements of mysticism. Imagine lofty ideas about the soul's cosmic journey, the fundamental nature of ultimate reality, and the intricate ladder connecting the material to the divine, all delivered with geometric precision. Hypatia's lectures were far from being dull academic exercises. Her reputation was powerfully magnetic. Students flocked not only from Alexandria but from all corners of the vast empire, eager to absorb knowledge at her feet. Many of these students were upper-class Roman men who, ironically, learned about logic and discipline from a woman whom their own societies would typically have silenced. She taught publicly, not in secret, boldly riding through the city in her distinctive philosopher's cloak, commanding attention in bustling forums and grand amphitheaters, often delivering speeches before diverse crowds. It wasn't just her profound knowledge that captivated, it was her exceptional character. Hypatia was famously ascetic, showing no interest in personal wealth or fleeting pleasures. She remained unmarried, perhaps deliberately, to steadfastly maintain her independence and philosophical purity. According to one widely retold story, likely apocryphal but still remarkably telling, when a student attempted to pursue her romantically, she rebuffed him by dramatically flinging a bloody menstrual rag at him and declaring, "This is what you truly love, young man, not beauty." Point taken, indeed. Yet despite her stoicism, she was not cold or unfeeling. Many of her students adored her not only as a brilliant teacher but also as a profound moral guide. Some of them later rose to become influential bishops, respected judges, and powerful governors. In particular, Synesius of Cyrene, one of her most devoted students, later became a Christian bishop, yet he maintained his deep reverence for Hypatia throughout his entire life, writing letters to her that read like a fascinating combination of fan mail, complex philosophical inquiry, and heartfelt spiritual therapy. She wasn't just a scholar. She was the living embodiment of Alexandria's ancient soul, fiercely scientific, deeply philosophical, remarkably tolerant, and dangerously brilliant in a world that was steadily growing more intolerant with each passing day. By the time Hypatia reached her intellectual prime, the great library of Alexandria, once the undisputed crown jewel of human knowledge, was merely a ghost of its former self. The original structure had been largely destroyed through successive waves of war, persistent neglect, and escalating political chaos. What little remained was scattered across the city. Annexes, precious scrolls hidden in private collections, and a handful of dedicated scholars still desperately clinging to the fading dream of universal knowledge. Among them, none shone more brightly than Hypatia. Although she wasn't the official librarian of the surviving fragments, many considered her the de facto heir to that monumental legacy. She diligently edited and preserved crucial mathematical texts, most notably the works by Diophantus and Apollonius. Some scholars even believe she contributed to the practical design of the astrolabe and the hydrometer, essential tools for astronomy and precise measurement. That's right, she wasn't just theorizing about the celestial bodies. She was actively helping to construct the very instruments used to observe them. And then there was her detailed commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest, an incredibly complex astronomical treatise filled with intricate mathematical models explaining planetary motion. Most people couldn't even pronounce its name, let alone attempt to improve upon it. But Hypatia's revisions made the work significantly more accessible for future generations, thereby ensuring its crucial survival through the coming ages. Ironically, her meticulous edits would become standard in Arabic translations centuries later, long after the Roman world had largely forgotten her name. But Hypatia was not interested in hoarding knowledge. She believed fervently in relentlessly sharing it. Her classroom was wherever she happened to stand. Whether she was diagramming parabolas or intricately deconstructing Plato's forms, she never treated science and philosophy as separate domains. To her, they were intrinsically united, the human mind and the vast cosmos, comprising one interconnected system. This profound belief earned her immense reverence, but it also made her increasingly vulnerable. Because Alexandria was undergoing a radical transformation, Christian bishops were rapidly gaining political power. Ancient temples were being converted into churches, and suspicion towards any form of pagan knowledge was growing dangerously. Hypatia, a philosopher firmly rooted in classical tradition, began to be perceived not just as a teacher but as a distinct threat. She was a woman who taught astronomy instead of theology, who dared to question rather than simply obey, and who remained publicly unaffiliated with any specific religion. It didn't matter that some of her students were Christians or that she displayed no open hostility towards the church. What mattered was the powerful symbolism she embodied. Hypatia represented the old world, a world of open reason and free inquiry. And in a city that was rapidly turning towards rigid dogma, that stance was considered far more dangerous than any ancient scroll. By the early 5th century, Alexandria was no longer the serene intellectual cradle it once aspired to be. It had transformed into a volatile pressure cooker of religious fervor, intense political rivalries, and rampant street-level violence. Hypatia, whether she desired it or not, had become more than just a philosopher. She was now a powerful symbol, and symbols, unfortunately, tend to attract angry mobs. The tension within the city was palpable. On one side stood the pagan and intellectual elite, desperately clinging to the fading remnants of Greco-Roman culture. On the other, the rapidly rising tide of Christianity, no longer a persecuted faith but now an assertive, politically dominant force. And caught in the middle were the Roman administrators, attempting to maintain peace with all the effectiveness of a person trying to mop the ocean. The newly appointed Christian bishop of Alexandria, Cyril, was fiercely ambitious, profoundly influential, and determined to cement the church's supreme authority over the city. He was a man who wielded theology with the precision of a sword and politics with the cunning of a dagger. And Alexandria, fractured by conflicting ideologies, provided the perfect battleground for his campaign. Cyril's mission was twofold: to eradicate heresy and to firmly assert the absolute supremacy of the church over all civil authority. And he wasted no time. He closed Novatian churches, expelled Jews from the city, and aggressively expanded his influence over both the pulpit and the streets. His sermons didn't just inspire, they effectively mobilized the populace. He understood the power of public spectacle, of aligning divine rhetoric with physical force, and the parabolani, that unofficial militant arm of the church, became his physical presence on the streets. Naturally, this did not sit well with Orestes, the imperial governor. Though a Christian himself, Orestes staunchly upheld Rome's long-standing policy of religious tolerance. He resisted Cyril's aggressive moves, particularly those that encroached upon civil law. Their relationship deteriorated faster than a marble rolling down a temple staircase. Orestes attempted diplomacy. He attempted containment. What he received in return was escalating violence. When a Christian mob attempted to assassinate him, hurling stones during a public address, and one monk, Ammonius, was arrested and subsequently executed for the attack, Cyril outrageously hailed him as a martyr. The rift had now become an open, festering wound. And tragically caught in this high-stakes power struggle was Hypatia. Respected by Orestes, resented by Cyril's followers, and utterly impossible to ignore. She wasn't overtly political, but her profound intellect and widespread influence made her a distinct threat. Her very existence undermined the prevalent idea that wisdom flowed exclusively through the church. A woman, a pagan, an astronomer, and a close advisor to Cyril's greatest political adversary. It mattered little that Hypatia commanded no army, nor did she harbor any ambition for political office. In a city where theology and political power had become indistinguishable, neutrality was now the most perilous position of all. And Cyril's ominous silence regarding the escalating whispers against her would prove deafening. Because in Alexandria, when people begin to point fingers and accuse others of being witches, it's only a matter of time before someone lights the fatal fire. By 414 CE, Alexandria had transformed into a city where conviction no longer required truth, only widespread suspicion and a compliant crowd. Hypatia, once celebrated across the entire empire as a philosopher of unparalleled brilliance, was now being deliberately recast in darker tones by her relentless enemies. Whispers spread like a rapidly contagious plague, claiming she was a malevolent sorceress, that she held Orestes under her manipulative spell, and that she was actively plotting against the Christian Church. None of these accusations had any factual basis whatsoever, but facts were no longer considered important or fashionable. Much of the insidious propaganda against Hypatia exploited her very public visibility. She was a prominent public figure, riding confidently in her chariot, openly teaching her students, and frequently consulting with high-ranking officials. That kind of unbridled confidence in a woman, no less, profoundly offended the rigid worldview that was taking root among Alexandria's religious hardliners. To them, Hypatia represented everything that was perceived as wrong with the old world. She was female, deeply philosophical, and defiantly unconverted to Christianity. Rumors falsely claimed she worshipped demons, that she practiced dark, forbidden arts, and that her intricate astrolabes were actually magical instruments used to bend the will of men. In reality, they were simply advanced scientific tools. But science, in an age gripped by rampant religious extremism, can appear horrifyingly similar to sorcery to those who either fail to understand it or actively choose not to. One particularly damaging story even accused her of actively preventing reconciliation between Governor Orestes and Bishop Cyril. The flawed logic was as follows. Hypatia advised Orestes. Orestes opposed Cyril. Therefore, Hypatia must be the ultimate root of the conflict. A neat, simple, and utterly lethal syllogism. The streets of Alexandria buzzed with unrest and escalating tension. It was no longer a question of if something tragic would happen to Hypatia, but rather when and how violently. The Parabolani, once humble caretakers of the poor, had fully transformed into zealous fanatics eager for a violent cause. And the city's Christian majority, already predisposed to view Hypatia as a dangerous pagan which required only the slightest hint of approval to act. That decisive nod never publicly came from Cyril. He was far too shrewd and careful for such a blatant act. However, his explicit refusal to condemn the rampant rumors, to quell the widespread hysteria, or to publicly defend a woman he undoubtedly knew was innocent, spoke volumes. Silence, after all, is merely another form of powerful signal. And so, the trap slowly, invisibly closed around Hypatia, not with physical chains but with insidious whispers and accusatory pointed fingers. It was the kind of prison you never truly perceive until it is tragically too late. It tragically occurred in the spring of 415 CE. Hypatia, then in her mid-50s, still continued to ride her chariot through Alexandria's bustling streets, still passionately taught her eager students, and still dared to exist in defiant contradiction to the malicious narrative her enemies had so carefully constructed. She likely sensed the escalating danger. The glances she received had turned openly hostile, the whispers had grown sharper, and the very atmosphere was thick with palpable menace. But she steadfastly carried on, a living rebuke to rampant fanaticism. And then one fateful day, they finally came for her. It was not an organized trial or an official sanctioned execution. It was a mob, frenzied, self-righteous, and overflowing with visceral hate. Led by members of the Parabolani and allegedly incited by a man named Peter, a church reader, they intercepted her directly in the streets. She was brutally dragged from her chariot, stripped of her clothing, and hauled into a nearby church building, a supposedly sacred space transformed into a horrific butcher's den. What transpired next is incredibly difficult to describe without flinching. Contemporary accounts, particularly that of the historian Socrates Scholasticus, state that the mob murdered her with roof tiles or oyster shells, literally flaying the flesh from her bones. Other accounts claim they tore her body apart limb by limb. What we do know for certain is that after they brutally killed her, they then burned her remains. This was an additional insult, as if erasing every physical trace of her existence would somehow legitimize their heinous deed. It was a murder driven not by official policy but by raw, unbridled passion. The kind fueled by dangerous ideology, not by any semblance of legality. There was no trial, no verdict, just execution by unrestrained rage. Alexandria lost more than just one remarkable woman that day. It lost its very last voice of the classical tradition, its final public philosopher, and arguably its last genuine claim to the cosmopolitan spirit that had once so vividly defined it. Governor Orestes was utterly powerless to respond effectively. Bishop Cyril? He expressed a perfunctory regret, but swiftly distanced himself from any direct responsibility. There were no arrests made, no public inquiry launched. The chilling silence that had preceded Hypatia's brutal death was followed by even more silence and then, gradually, a collective forgetting. But the profound damage was irrevocably done. With Hypatia's death, a symbolic door violently slammed shut on antiquity's glorious age of reason. It marked the definitive end of Alexandria as a leading intellectual capital and the grim beginning of its descent into rigid theological inflexibility. Her mutilated body served as the final, brutal punctuation mark on centuries of slow cultural erosion. A brilliant scholar was senselessly killed. An entire world of intellectual freedom was tragically lost. In the weeks following Hypatia's brutal murder, Alexandria fell into an eerie, unsettling quiet. Not because peace had miraculously returned, but because something profoundly essential had died within the city's soul. The streets still teemed with activity. Churches still resonated with chants. Bureaucrats still efficiently stamped scrolls. But the true spirit of the city, that vibrant, open exchange of thought, that masterful synthesis of Greek philosophy, Roman governance, and Egyptian mysticism, had dimmed forever. There was no justice whatsoever for Hypatia. No trial, no restitution for her murder. Orestes, already politically weakened, eventually vanished from the historical record. Some historians suggest he simply left Alexandria, too politically isolated to continue governing. Others claim he was recalled to Rome. Regardless, the one man in power who had actively tried to shield her was now gone. And Bishop Cyril? He emerged from the crisis stronger and more influential than ever. Although Cyril denied direct involvement in her death, many interpreted his strategic silence and inflammatory rhetoric as tacit approval. He made absolutely no effort to punish the killers. He never publicly condemned the heinous act. In due course, he was even canonized, becoming Saint Cyril of Alexandria, remembered more for his fierce battles against heresy than for the brilliant philosopher whose blood had been spilled under his very watch. As for Hypatia, her rich legacy was swiftly buried, not merely physically but intellectually. Her name was meticulously scrubbed from many official records. Her invaluable writings were lost to time, her profound teachings were often attributed to others, and her crucial contributions to mathematics and astronomy were scattered throughout history with only faint, almost imperceptible traces of her authorship. In the blink of a historical eye, one of late antiquity's most brilliant minds was tragically reduced to a mere whisper. But whispers, it turns out, have a remarkable tendency to linger. Centuries later, Hypatia's compelling story began its slow, inevitable resurfacing. First, in the eloquent writings of Renaissance humanists, who recognized in her a powerful martyr for reason. Then, in Enlightenment salons, where she became a potent symbol of intellectual freedom brutally suppressed by oppressive dogma. By the 19th and 20th centuries, she was once again elevated. The pioneering woman philosopher, the last valiant guardian of Alexandria's ancient wisdom, a truly tragic figure whose brutal death marked the definitive twilight of classical civilization. Still, what we understand about Hypatia today largely originates from the accounts of men. Devoted students like Synesius, respected historians like Socrates Scholasticus, and later chroniclers attempting to painstakingly piece together a shattered mosaic. The woman herself? Her original voice was silenced, but her silence ultimately became a roaring thunder. Despite the centuries of enforced silence, Hypatia resolutely refused to be forgotten. Her name, once almost completely erased from history, consistently resurfaced in every era that dared to question authority and genuinely valued the relentless pursuit of truth. She transcended being merely a historical figure. She transformed into a powerful symbol, not just of a brutally murdered scholar, but of a profound idea: that reason must steadfastly hold its ground, even when the world descends into violent chaos. During the Renaissance, influential thinkers rediscovered her tragic story and hailed her as a martyr to widespread ignorance. In the Age of Enlightenment, prominent philosophers and skeptics pointed to Hypatia as undeniable proof of the dire consequences when rigid religious belief crushes open inquiry. Voltaire himself wrote of her with passionate fury, portraying her death as the final, decisive nail in the coffin of classical learning. She was famously cast as a tragic heroine in numerous plays, poems, and later novels, often with some exaggeration, yes, but consistently admired. In modern times, her compelling story has inspired scientists, feminists, and secularists alike. To mathematicians, she stands as one of the earliest recorded women in their field, a powerful forerunner to those who continue to fight for representation in STEM disciplines today. To women in philosophy, she is an ancient pioneer, one who not only participated in intellectual life but actively helped shape it. And to humanists, she serves as a stark, sobering reminder of how fragile knowledge can truly be when confronted by overwhelming fear. But Hypatia's legacy is far more than purely symbolic. Although most of her original written work has regrettably vanished, scholars strongly suspect her enduring influence remains deeply embedded in the very survival of crucial Greek mathematical texts. Her meticulous additions and insightful commentaries likely became the definitive versions that subsequently filtered into Arabic and later European scholarship. So, even in her silence, her intellectual fingerprints remained discernible on the very instruments of learning. There's a profound irony in that. The fanatical mob that brutally tore her apart sought to destroy not just the woman, but every single principle she passionately stood for. And yet, Hypatia ultimately endured, not within physical temples or churches, but within the minds of countless generations who steadfastly refused to let her name vanish into oblivion. Today, statues proudly bear her likeness, schools honor her name, and thinkers from all walks of life invoke her memory whenever the world begins to slip dangerously back into ignorance. She stands not merely as the last brilliant light of Alexandria, but as an enduring challenge to each of us, to speak clearly, to think boldly, and never to cower before the irrationality of the mob. Because truth, much like Hypatia herself, may bleed, but it does not truly break. Beneath a serene stretch of the Italian Alps, located just 30 miles from the city of Turin, lies a secret that truly defies belief. It isn't marked on any old map, nor is it publicly advertised to tourists. There are no ancient Roman ruins, no grand medieval cathedrals. Instead, concealed beneath the picturesque mountain village of Vidraco is an immense, meticulously hand-carved underground complex, a sprawling labyrinth of sacred chambers known collectively as the temples of humankind. And for nearly 2 decades, no one outside a small, dedicated spiritual community even knew they existed. This is not some minor cave adorned with a few simple frescoes. The temples extend across 5 subterranean levels, intricately connected by a network of winding passageways, elegant spiral staircases, and magnificent domes that could rival the architectural grandeur of great surface cathedrals. They are adorned with sacred art, dazzling mosaics, intricate stained glass, complex cosmic symbology, and shimmering golden altars, all painstakingly chiseled, painted, and installed by hand. It's as if someone attempted to recreate the Sistine Chapel underground, then added Egyptian hieroglyphs, Buddhist mandalas, Mayan glyphs, and even galactic maps for good measure. And who was responsible for building this marvel? Not the Vatican, not some ancient esoteric order with centuries of tradition. No, it was a relatively unknown spiritual collective calling themselves Damanhur, named after the ancient Egyptian city believed to be the historical center of Horus worship. Founded in 1975, the The group envisioned a society based on principles of harmony, self-sufficiency, and profound spiritual evolution. The temples were their tangible manifestation of that ambitious dream, a sacred space meticulously designed to realign human consciousness with the expansive universe. Construction commenced in 1978, spearheaded by Oberto Audi, a former insurance broker who had transformed into a mystic visionary. Without official permission, without formal blueprints, and utilizing only basic hand tools, Audi and his devoted followers burrowed into the solid rock beneath a private house. They worked diligently at night, discreetly using the removed soil to landscape the surrounding hills, and told absolutely no one. It was a unique form of spiritual resistance, building in secret what they believed could not be openly constructed. And they succeeded in doing so for an astonishing 17 years. No one suspected that behind the unassuming facade of a countryside home, a dedicated team of artists, engineers, and fervent believers was meticulously carving a subterranean wonder. Not until a disgruntled former member finally tipped off the authorities in the 1990s, and the Italian police, expecting to discover perhaps a simple bunker or a tax shelter, came face to face with one of the most astonishing underground structures in modern Europe. The temples of humankind did not simply materialize out of thin air. They were the direct result of a grand, highly unconventional vision that originated in the mind of a man named Oberto Audi, later affectionately known to his followers as Falco. In the 1970s, Audi had not yet become a spiritual guru. He held a fairly ordinary job as an insurance agent in northern Italy. But beneath this mundane exterior, he was deeply engrossed in metaphysics, the concept of reincarnation, the wisdom of ancient civilizations, and what he termed the memory of the cosmos. Audi claimed that from a very young age, he experienced vivid past life memories, not just vague impressions, but incredibly detailed visions of lives lived in long-lost civilizations, including Atlantis and ancient Egypt. He firmly believed these memories were not mere fantasies, but rather precise blueprints. And one of those blueprints, he asserted, was for a magnificent temple, not a metaphorical one, but a literal sanctuary for spiritual awakening, destined to be hidden underground and meticulously constructed by a community united in purpose. So in 1975, he gathered a small group of like-minded individuals in the beautiful Alpine foothills. They shared his ambitious dream of creating a self-sufficient, spiritually evolved society. The group adopted the name Damanhur, after the ancient Egyptian city of the same name, which was believed to be the historical home of Horus worship and profound esoteric knowledge. Their fundamental mission was not to establish a new religion, but to build an entirely new kind of society, one that skillfully balanced science, art, ecology, and spirituality. Damanhur grew steadily and quietly. Members willingly gave up their previous lives to embrace communal living in the picturesque Italian countryside. They practiced meditation, sacred dance, and even developed a unique, made-up language they believed enhanced communication on a subtle level. They created their own currency. They diligently studied ancient texts and claimed to be able to communicate directly with trees. To outsiders, it all seemed charming at best, perhaps eccentric at worst. But to its devoted followers, they were laying the crucial groundwork for a grand cosmic rebirth. Beneath all of this, however, lay the true secret. Construction had already commenced. Audi claimed he had vividly seen the temple in his visions. Every room, every hall, every golden altar. With picks, hammers, simple buckets, and unwavering conviction, the Damanhurians began their excavation, uncertain if they would ever truly finish or if they would be discovered. They weren't just digging into stone. They were digging into belief itself, meticulously shaping a sanctuary intended not for the present, but for a future they passionately believed was imminent. From the outside, the unassuming house situated at the top of the hill in Vidraco appeared utterly ordinary. Just a modest alpine home perched quietly above the valley. But concealed beneath its floors, accessible through a secret trapdoor hidden beneath a carpet, lay the entrance to an ever-expanding tunnel network. It was here, under the protective cloak of night and profound silence, that the dedicated people of Damanhur undertook what can only be described as an architectural marvel, meticulously constructing a sprawling underground temple complex entirely by hand. Construction commenced in 1978. There were no towering cranes, no powerful backhoes, no formal engineering teams in hard hats. Just a handful of individuals armed with pickaxes, hammers, and lanterns. They tunneled directly into solid rock using only basic tools, painstakingly removing the debris bucket by bucket, often laboring throughout the night to avoid detection. The excavated earth was quietly and subtly distributed across the surrounding landscape, ingeniously used to shape new gardens and terraces, leaving absolutely no visible sign that anything extraordinary was happening below ground. The work was incredibly dangerous. The entire construction was unsanctioned by authorities. There were no safety codes to adhere to. A single misstep could have triggered a catastrophic collapse, burying them alive. But the Damanhurians firmly believed they were protected by unwavering faith, a sense of destiny, and the guiding influence of higher intelligences. This was not merely construction. It was a sacred ritual. Every powerful strike of the hammer was considered a devotional act. Audi, or Falco, maintained he had already seen the completed temple in a vivid vision. Every room, every hall, every shimmering golden altar. His detailed sketches guided the intricate layout, domes symbolizing different spiritual principles, all interconnected by winding passageways filled with art and light. Each chamber had a specific function, for meditation, for healing, or for energy alignment. The architecture was profoundly driven by sacred geometry and esoteric symbolism, rather than modern utility. Even as more members joined the monumental project, the intense secrecy remained unbroken. Families shared stories of their children growing up playing innocently above the temple floor, completely unaware of the wonders being created beneath their very feet. Somehow, for nearly 15 remarkable years, no neighbor reported any strange activities. No curious locals accidentally stumbled into the wrong doorway. No authority figures ever knocked at their door. By the early 1990s, they had meticulously carved out an enormous underground space large enough to house several floors of elaborately decorated halls, all without a single outsider knowing of its existence. It was an astounding feat of human persistence, perhaps madness, undeniable artistry, or perhaps a unique combination of all three. They weren't just building a temple. They were actively defying the modern world by proving that something ancient and sacred could still be born, hidden beneath its very surface. For nearly 17 remarkable years, the temples of humankind remained one of the best-kept secrets in modern Europe. But as is often the case with all secrets, this one eventually came to light. And it happened not with a quiet whisper, but with a dramatic bang. In 1992, a former Damanhur member, feeling bitter over a dispute with the community's leadership, decided to report the existence of the extensive underground complex to the Italian authorities. He claimed there was an enormous, illegal structure buried deep beneath the Alps, one that was not officially registered, not properly inspected, and most certainly not approved. To the government, the claim sounded utterly absurd, an entire temple system constructed by a cult, without anyone ever noticing. Still, officials were legally obligated to investigate. When police arrived at the site in Vidraco, they expected, at most, to find an unauthorized basement or perhaps a small makeshift bunker. What they actually discovered was beyond anything they could have possibly anticipated. Upon entering through the cleverly concealed trapdoor, they descended into vast chambers glittering with intricate mosaics, golden altars, and vibrant stained glass windows, all located deep underground. They beheld magnificent marble pillars, soaring vaulted domes, and sacred symbology drawn from every known spiritual tradition. The officers were utterly stunned. Some reports even suggest they initially believed they had stumbled upon a lost civilization. The sheer size and breathtaking artistry of the temples defied all logical explanation. This was not merely a secret room. This was a multi-level architectural marvel meticulously carved directly out of bedrock, hidden remarkably in plain sight. News of the astonishing discovery spread rapidly, and public reaction was a chaotic mix of intense fascination, outright outrage, and widespread bureaucratic panic. The Italian government, initially alarmed, immediately issued a strict stop-work order and threatened to permanently seal off the complex. After all, no permits had ever been filed, and there were serious concerns about the structural safety of the subterranean structure. But something unexpected then occurred. Instead of recoiling in fear or outright ridicule, the public was overwhelmingly intrigued. Photographs of the intricate chambers, particularly the dazzling hall of mirrors and the serene blue temple, began circulating widely in Italian newspapers. People were captivated. Who were these people? How did they manage to build this? And why? Damanhur, now facing either complete extinction or a necessary public revelation, chose to open its doors. They boldly invited officials, journalists, and even skeptical scientists to tour the temples. And what these visitors witnessed was undeniable. Not the work of a reclusive cult, but a monumental artistic and spiritual endeavor of staggering proportions. In attempting to conceal their ambitious vision, Damanhur had, inadvertently, created an absolute marvel. And now the world eagerly wanted to explore it. Once the extraordinary secret was revealed, there was no possibility of turning back. With the looming threat of demolition, the Damanhur community made a bold and decisive choice: complete transparency. Rather than denying or attempting to conceal their incredible creation, they extended an invitation to the world to come inside and witness it. It was a calculated risk, but it yielded spectacularly positive results. Journalists, experienced archaeologists, skilled engineers, and even initially skeptical government officials were personally escorted deep into the mountain to see what had been meticulously carved beneath their very feet. And what they discovered was less like a clandestine cult lair and more akin to an underground Vatican that had somehow merged with the subconscious mind of Antoni Gaudi. There was the magnificent Hall of Mirrors, a colossal chamber featuring mirrored walls, a breathtaking stained glass ceiling, and intricately tiled floors that reflected light like a vibrant kaleidoscope of pure energy. There was also the serene Hall of Earth, shaped like a sacred chalice, specifically dedicated to the feminine principle and ancient earth goddesses. Each temple within the complex was designed with remarkable precision, not only artistically but also energetically, aligned with what the Damanhurians believed were crucial synchronic lines, cosmic pathways of subtle energy crisscrossing the entire earth. The very architecture was constructed to resonate deeply with these lines, thereby amplifying their energetic effects and transforming the entire space into a kind of spiritual engine. Italian authorities, now confronted by widespread public fascination and intense media buzz, found themselves facing a unique dilemma. Yes, the temples were technically illegal, having been built without permits, but demolishing them would mean destroying a truly modern artistic marvel that had captured the public's vivid imagination. In a rare instance of bureaucratic leniency, the government opted to regulate rather than erase. Instead of shutting the complex down entirely, they permitted Damanhur to retain ownership under very strict safety and preservation guidelines. Engineers meticulously reviewed the structural integrity of the complex. Historians carefully cataloged the rich symbolism. Artists simply stood in profound awe. By the mid-1990s, the temples of humankind had been transformed from a forbidden mystery into a globally recognized cultural phenomenon. The community initiated guided tours and organized spiritual retreats. Filmmakers and photographers extensively documented the magnificent halls. Critics, of course, remained vocal, but widespread curiosity far outweighed any condemnation. What had once been hidden was now openly accessible to the world. And in a strange, ironic reversal, the very secrecy that had initially protected the temples had now become their most powerful marketing tool. People no longer just came to witness impressive art. They came to stand inside a profound miracle that, by all accounts, was not supposed to exist. The mountain had successfully kept its secret for years. Now it was softly whispering it to everyone who would listen. To an untrained observer, the temples of humankind might appear to be an eclectic art project that spiraled out of control, a chaotic explosion of colors, symbols, and cosmic flair. But to the devoted Damanhurians, every single square inch serves a profound purpose. This wasn't merely a sacred space. It was envisioned as a sophisticated machine for human consciousness, a metaphysical tool meticulously designed to amplify spiritual energy, awaken latent human potential, and ultimately realign humanity with the grand cosmos. At the very core of Damanhur's intricate philosophy is the deep-seated belief that Earth is crisscrossed by intricate synchronic lines, energetic currents akin to ancient ley lines or the meridians used in acupuncture. These lines, they assert, connect powerful sacred sites across the entire planet. The pyramids of Egypt, the enigmatic Stonehenge, the mystical Machu Picchu, and now, their very own underground temples in Vidraco. The temples were not arbitrarily placed. They were deliberately constructed at the precise intersection of these powerful lines, transforming them, in Damanhurian logic, into a kind of interdimensional charging station. Each individual chamber within the temples explicitly reflects a distinct spiritual concept. The Hall of Water, for instance, is solemnly dedicated to past lives and emotional healing. The Hall of Spheres is considered the temple's energetic nucleus, a central place specifically intended to facilitate communication with higher intelligences and distant civilizations. No, not metaphorically. The Damanhurians genuinely believe that consciousness exists beyond Earth and that the temples function as a powerful beacon for this connection. It's not just symbolic theory. The community meticulously incorporates specific elements of sound, sacred geometry, and material resonance into the very architecture to actively activate these energies. Walls are carefully embedded with copper coils. Quartz crystals are strategically positioned to reflect specific frequencies. Every single element, from the chosen colors to the intricate symbols and the selected materials, is based on how it powerfully resonates with human consciousness and planetary harmonics. Visitors often recount experiencing strange phenomena, feeling inexplicable waves of energy, hearing unidentifiable tones, or entering altered states of awareness. Whether these experiences are mere placebo effects or genuine interactions with an unseen power grid, the temples undeniably seem to have a profound effect. Even skeptical scientists have noted unusually strong electromagnetic activity within some chambers. But for the Damanhurian faithful, scientific observation merely confirms what they already intuitively know. This is a living temple, a dynamic entity that actively interacts with intention, emotion, and thought. It serves as a vital bridge not just between Earth and the distant stars, but between what we currently are and what we possess the potential to become. In their eyes, the temples of humankind are not a relic belonging to the past, but a visionary prototype for the future that is yet to unfold. While the extensive underground temples are undoubtedly the most visually spectacular aspect of Damanhur, they represent only one component of a much larger and ongoing spiritual experiment. Above ground, the Federation of Damanhur operates as a unique, intentional micronation, complete with its own carefully crafted constitution, a distinct currency, specialized schools, and even a unique timekeeping system. That's right, they utilize their own calendar, which notably began in 1975, the very year the Federation was founded. In Damanhurian reckoning, we are currently in year 50-something. The community itself is meticulously organized into various eco-villages, each designated for a specific purpose: farming, artistic pursuits, scientific research, healing practices, or direct temple work. Daily life is a harmonious blend of the mystical and the mundane. Residents cultivate their own food, actively participate in group meditations, and gather for weekly social alchemy sessions designed to align the individual's spiritual progress with the group's collective evolution. At its peak, Damanhur boasted over 1,000 members originating from more than 30 different countries. Newcomers don't simply join casually. They undergo a rigorous initiation process and are actively encouraged to live communally, relinquish some personal possessions, and contribute their unique skills to the collective good. Professions within the community range widely, from skilled sculptors to proficient software developers. Everyone is expected to contribute meaningfully to the holistic well-being of the collective. Education plays an enormous role in Damanhurian life. Children are taught not only conventional subjects like math and language, but also sacred geometry, ancient mythology, and advanced energy awareness. There's even a Damanhurian university offering specialized courses in esoteric sciences, spiritual physics, and alternative healing methods. If this sounds somewhat like Hogwarts with added solar panels, you're not far from the truth. At the profound philosophical center of it all is the core idea that divinity exists in all things and that humanity's ultimate purpose is to awaken to its inherent role as co-creator with the universe. This translates into living harmoniously with nature, exploring the depths of consciousness, and utilizing creativity as a powerful spiritual tool. To outsiders, the community can sometimes appear eccentric, perhaps even cult-like. But there is no single deity, no enforced dogma, and no charismatic tyrant dictating terms. Leadership is democratic, and roles rotate regularly. Members are entirely free to leave, and many do. Critics certainly exist. Some former members cite internal pressures, ideological rigidity, or burnout as reasons for their departure. But through it all, the Federation has remarkably endured, not by isolating itself from the outside world, but by actively opening its gates to it. Today, the temples stand as a powerful symbol of possibility, a testament to what can be created when profound art, focused intention, and a strong sense of community converge. They serve as a poignant reminder that the great sacred sites of the ancient world, the majestic pyramids, the towering cathedrals, the colossal ziggurats, were not merely impressive buildings. They were powerful expressions of collective belief. Damanhur dares to ask a bold question. Why did we, as humanity, cease building in such a manner? And perhaps that is the true legacy of the temples of humankind. Not their specific beliefs, but their audacious boldness. In a world often consumed by efficiency and spectacle, a group of ordinary people made the extraordinary decision to dig into the earth and meticulously create something sacred by hand, in silence, purely for the sake of beauty and spirit. It is not just a temple. It is a profound question powerfully carved into stone. What are you creating with your life? Long before satellites orbited Earth or sailors shouted, "Land ho!" human beings were already constantly on the move. They traced coastlines, traversed vast deserts, and meticulously scribbled their understanding of the world onto clay, stone, or animal hide. Travel wasn't merely about curiosity. It was fundamentally about survival. The very first explorers weren't adventurers in the modern sense. They were resourceful gatherers and shrewd traders, resilient hunters and desperate refugees. But over time, movement transcended mere necessity. It became a strategic imperative and eventually, a lasting legacy. The earliest maps were not grand cartographic masterpieces. They were simple, scratched patterns on cave walls, rudimentary carvings on bones, or ephemeral mental images passed down orally through generations. Around 2300 BCE, the Babylonians meticulously etched one of the first known maps onto a clay tablet. Not a map of the entire world, but of a specific region, clearly marked with rivers, towns, and mountains. To them, the Earth was perceived as a flat disk surrounded by a cosmic ocean, with Babylon naturally positioned at its very center. It wasn't geographically precise, but it conveyed something even more significant: profound intent. These ancient people desired to comprehend their surroundings. They yearned to navigate its complexities. But how do you travel without established roads, clear signage, or comprehensive star charts? You meticulously observe the sun. You diligently study the stars. You commit to memory the intricate terrain, the migratory patterns of animals, and the precise direction of the wind. And if you were fortunate, you'd pass that invaluable knowledge to someone who could remember it even better than you could. Ancient Polynesians, for example, mastered complex navigation using subtle ocean swells, the flight paths of birds, and the precise positions of constellations. Meanwhile, traders in Mesopotamia followed major river routes like the Tigris and Euphrates, effectively transforming seasonal floods into navigable shipping lanes. In these early civilizations, travel was rarely undertaken alone. It was a communal endeavor, inherently slow, and often fraught with danger. Travelers risked encountering bandits, devastating storms, debilitating diseases, and the simple, terrifying prospect of being lost forever. But in their journeys, they also transported vital goods, diverse languages, innovative ideas, and groundbreaking technologies across vast regions. Trade routes began to form, resembling intricate veins spanning the ancient world. Exploration didn't need to reach entirely new continents to be revolutionary. Sometimes it was sufficient to reach the next city-state, the next life-sustaining oasis, or the next fertile valley. These seemingly tiny steps created the intricate web of human interaction that would eventually coalesce into civilization itself. So when we discuss ancient exploration, we're not just speaking about distant journeys. We're referring to a primal human urge to understand what lies beyond the visible horizon and to leave an indelible mark on the unknown. The ancient Egyptians weren't particularly known for extensive wandering, but when they did travel, they did so with considerable flair, ritual, and often a heavily armed escort. The Nile River served as their primary highway, and it wasn't solely for leisurely pleasure cruises. Pharaohs dispatched meticulous expeditions south to Nubia, east into the rugged Sinai Peninsula, and even further into mysterious, distant lands like Punt, a semi-mythical kingdom that Egyptians reverently called God's Land. Its precise location remains debated by scholars. Was it Somalia? Eritrea? Southern Arabia? No one is entirely certain, but what is undeniable is that the Egyptians sent ships there, laden with valuable goods and fervent prayers, hoping to return with precious incense, gleaming gold, exotic animals, and a heightened sense of divine prestige. One of the most famously recorded expeditions occurred during the powerful reign of Queen Hatshepsut, Egypt's formidable female pharaoh. Around 1478 BCE, she launched a significant voyage to Punt and proudly documented the entire journey on the grand walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. The detailed carvings depict massive ships, men carefully carrying retrieves, and locals with distinctive features and elaborate headdresses. This was far more than mere trade. It was a complex blend of diplomacy, propaganda, and spiritual alignment, all rolled into one grand endeavor. Egyptians also ventured into the Sinai Peninsula, not just for conquest but to mine valuable turquoise and copper. These expeditions frequently involved hundreds of workers, scribes, soldiers, and priests. Travel was state-sponsored and meticulously documented. Pharaohs weren't sending lone adventurers. They were deploying vast logistical machines. Officials recorded every detail: what was mined, who participated, and how many offerings were presented to the gods to ensure a safe and successful journey. Despite being surrounded by vast, inhospitable deserts, Egypt was not entirely isolated. Caravans moved through the western desert, connecting various oases and bringing in goods from as far away as Libya. Sea travel, though inherently dangerous, facilitated contact with Byblos, Crete, and other crucial eastern Mediterranean ports. But make no mistake, ancient Egyptian travel was far from easy. Whether by land or by boat, expeditions were inherently slow, risky, and remarkably costly. Yet they were perceived as essential extensions of divine order. When the pharaoh moved, Egypt moved, and every single journey reinforced their profound worldview that Egypt was the absolute center of the universe, and everything else, whether friend, foe, or foreign, existed to be known, tamed, or honored. For them, exploration was not a rebellion against the gods. It was a sacred service to them. If ancient Egypt looked inward, focusing on its river and its gods, the Phoenicians were the ones gazing outward across the vast sea, meticulously constructing ships to chase the distant horizon. Emerging around 1500 BCE from the vibrant coastal cities of Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon in what is now modern-day Lebanon, the Phoenicians didn't conquer land. They strategically conquered water. And in doing so, they established themselves as the ancient world's most daring navigators and influential traders. They were not an empire in the traditional sense. They lacked vast armies or towering ziggurats, but they built something arguably far more impressive: an extensive maritime network. The Phoenicians established trade routes that stretched across the entire Mediterranean, from their homeland in the Levant to North Africa, to Cyprus, Sicily, Spain, and even to the mysterious edge of the Atlantic at the Strait of Gibraltar. Along these routes, they founded numerous cities, the most famous being Carthage, which would later rise to rival Rome itself. What was the secret to their success? Their remarkable boats. Sleek, fast, and incredibly durable, Phoenician ships were considered technological marvels of their era. They utilized a combination of oars and sails, featuring high hulls for protection and curved designs that efficiently cut through waves. These were not merely transport vessels. They were effectively floating marketplaces, laden with precious cedar wood, exquisite glassware, fine textiles dyed with their famous purple pigment, and even their revolutionary alphabetic script, which was carved into stone and traded like cutting-edge technology. Yes, the Phoenicians also gifted humanity one of the greatest tools for human connection: the alphabet. Their simplified script drastically improved writing, transitioning from complex cuneiform and hieroglyphs to a system of just 22 characters. This groundbreaking system would go on to profoundly influence Greek, Latin, and eventually our modern alphabets. But travel for the Phoenicians was not without its perils. Dangerous pirates prowled the waters. Sudden storms could crush ships into splinters, and every new harbor brought the inherent risk of encountering unfriendly locals or facing fierce economic competition. Still, they persisted not primarily as conquerors but as crucial connectors. They brought tin from distant Britain, silver from Iberia, papyrus from Egypt, and exotic spices from Arabia. Some historical sources, including the renowned Herodotus, even assert that Phoenician sailors, operating under Egyptian sponsorship, successfully circumnavigated the entire continent of Africa as early as the 6th century BCE. That is indeed a bold claim. But if any people in the ancient world possessed the skill and daring to achieve such a monumental feat, it was most likely the Phoenicians. They did not build colossal monuments. Instead, they meticulously built crucial trade routes, and in doing so, they mapped the very heart of the ancient world through the power of wind, wave, and commerce. While Mediterranean sailors bravely cut across waves and facilitated trade from city to city, far to the east, another type of extraordinary journey was unfolding. Slower, dustier, and equally transformative. In ancient China, travel didn't primarily involve ships on the vast sea. It meant endless caravans traversing formidable deserts, winding through towering mountains, and bravely navigating some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. This marked the inception of what we now famously call the Silk Road, a vast, intricate network of overland routes that interconnected East Asia with the Middle East, Central Asia, and eventually Europe. Its origins can be traced back to the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century BCE, when Emperor Wu of Han dispatched an emissary named Zhang Qian westward to establish crucial alliances against nomadic invaders. Zhang Qian ultimately failed in his direct political mission, but in doing so, he inadvertently discovered entire flourishing civilizations beyond China's western frontier. He returned years later with fascinating stories of Persian goods, powerful Central Asian horses, and exotic, captivating cultures. The emperor was not particularly pleased about the long delay, but he was utterly fascinated by the immense possibilities these discoveries presented. Trade routes rapidly blossomed. Chinese merchants began exporting highly sought-after goods such as silk, exquisite lacquerware, aromatic spices, precious jade, and delicate porcelain. Products so desirable that they quickly became potent status symbols from India all the way to Rome. In return, caravans brought back valuable horses, delicate glassware, fine wool, and gleaming gold. But it wasn't just physical goods that traversed these routes. Ideas, groundbreaking technologies, and diverse religions also flowed across borders. Buddhism, for example, journeyed from India directly into China. Artistic styles subtly merged. Musical instruments were exchanged and adopted. Even paper, a revolutionary invention originating in China, would eventually find its way westward, profoundly changing written communication forever. However, travel along the Silk Road was exceptionally brutal. Caravans had to cross the formidable Taklamakan Desert, ominously nicknamed the place from which no one returns. Sudden, violent sandstorms could easily bury unsuspecting travelers alive. Dangerous thieves lurked in remote mountain passes, and the sheer, immense distance, thousands of miles from Chang'an, modern Xi'an, to far-off cities like Samarkand or Antioch, could take many months or even several years to traverse. Travelers heavily relied on life-sustaining oases, where small, bustling trading cities flourished like verdant jewels in the vast desert. Places like Dunhuang, Kashgar, and Merv. No single empire ever managed to control the entirety of the Silk Road. It was kept alive by a complex patchwork of diverse kingdoms, nomadic tribes, and independent city-states, each maintaining a segment of the route and levying taxes on the goods that passed through. And yet, despite its inherent complexity and dangers, it remarkably functioned, creating an intricate web of connection that fundamentally reshaped the entire ancient world. The Silk Road was not merely a single trail. It was a complex circulatory system, vigorously pumping life, diverse beliefs, and grand ambition across multiple continents. While immense deserts, formidable rivers, and vast seas presented major obstacles to ancient travelers, the powerful Persian Empire adopted a remarkably different approach. They meticulously built roads, long, exceptionally durable, and remarkably well-maintained roads, and not just for the practical purpose of moving armies or transporting goods. For the Achaemenid Persians, these roads represented the very infrastructure of their sprawling empire itself, a strategic means to tie together a diverse patchwork of conquered lands, myriad languages, and varied cultures into a single, cohesive system. At the heart of this ambitious vision was the legendary Royal Road, commissioned by Darius the Great in the 5th century BCE. Stretching over an incredible 1,500 miles from Susa in Persia to Sardis near the Aegean Sea, this grand highway seamlessly connected the vast empire from its eastern to its western reaches, enabling royal couriers, resourceful merchants, and military officers to traverse immense distances at unprecedented speeds. Thanks to a highly efficient system of relay stations equipped with fresh horses and essential supplies, royal messengers could cover the entire extensive route in just 7 to 9 days, an astonishing achievement for that historical period. For direct comparison, an average traveler or merchant caravan undertaking the same journey would typically require approximately 3 months. But the Royal Road was not just exceptionally fast, it was also remarkably secure. Regular patrols, strategic fortifications, and well-maintained outposts ensured safety for all who traveled under the king's authoritative banner. Travelers from across the vast empire, ranging from diligent Babylonian scribes to eloquent Greek diplomats, utilized the Royal Road not only for the transportation of goods but also for the crucial exchange of ideas, the rapid spread of rumors, and the intricate dissemination of political information. In many significant ways, it became the empire's primary information superhighway. The Persian Empire's extensive road system extended far beyond just the Royal Road, intricately linking major cities like Ecbatana, Persepolis, and Babylon, and stretching outward towards Egypt, India, and Central Asia. Convenient way stations, known as caravanserai, offered much-needed rest and supplies for weary merchants and other travelers. These structures would later evolve to become vital components of Islamic and Silk Road travel centuries down the line. More than simply impressive infrastructure, Persian roads powerfully symbolized the empire's overarching desire to unite its many diverse parts not solely through military force, but through strategic connection. By standardizing coinage, establishing uniform weights, and promoting shared languages for official communication, the Persians made it considerably easier for people from disparate regions to interact, engage in trade, and actively participate in the expansive imperial economy. In a world where most movement was notoriously slow and often chaotic, Persia offered something genuinely revolutionary: order, sophisticated structure, and a meticulously designed system for efficient long-distance travel. In short, the Persians didn't just rule a vast empire. They remarkably engineered it. The ancient Greeks were not empire builders in the traditional sense, at least not initially. What they were, however, was extraordinarily curious. From the renowned historian Herodotus to the intrepid explorer Pytheas, Greek travelers roamed the ancient world, driven by a relentless quest for knowledge, profitable trade, and sometimes just pure wonder. For them, exploration wasn't always about military conquest. It was fundamentally a way to pose profound questions, collect captivating stories, and systematically map the still unknown. One of the earliest and most fascinating of these explorers was Pytheas of Massalia, modern Marseille, who, around 325 BCE, boldly sailed beyond the then-known world, navigating through the treacherous Straits of Gibraltar, ascending the Atlantic coast, and allegedly reaching a mysterious northern land he called Thule. Many scholars now believe he may have reached as far as Iceland or even Norway. He meticulously described strange phenomena like the midnight sun and frozen seas, concepts that Mediterranean readers at the time considered mythical. But Pythias was not a myth-maker. He was a dedicated scientist with the heart of a true sailor. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Mediterranean, Greek merchants and philosophers regularly traveled across Egypt, Persia, and India. Alexander the Great's transformative campaigns in the 4th century BCE dramatically opened up the Greek world, initiating the Hellenistic era where Greek became a widely adopted lingua franca stretching from Athens all the way to Bactria. Cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Seleucia evolved into vital crossroads for both goods and groundbreaking ideas. Travel was no longer an exception. It had become an expectation. Then came the Romans, the unparalleled engineers of empire. The Romans took the concept of travel and quite literally paved it. With their famously extensive road system, they intricately connected cities across vast swathes of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. At its peak, the Roman Empire boasted over 250,000 miles of meticulously constructed roads, including more than 50,000 miles of durable stone-paved highways. Roads like the iconic Via Appia, built as early as 312 BCE, were engineering marvels designed to endure for centuries, and many sections of them still exist and are used today. Roman roads primarily served military purposes, enabling legions to move rapidly to suppress rebellions, but they also crucially facilitated commerce, postal services, religious pilgrimages, and even early forms of tourism. Wealthy Romans embarked on journeys to visit Greek temples, the majestic Egyptian pyramids, and popular spa towns in Gaul. Guidebooks and intriguing travel anecdotes became widely popular reading material. To the Romans, travel was not merely practical. It was a powerful statement. Roads were concrete proof of the empire's immense reach. If a Roman road led to your town, it unequivocally meant your town held significance. And with every mile laid in stone, Rome fundamentally reshaped the ancient world's perception of both distance and connection. While overland routes like the legendary Silk Road carried caravans through vast deserts and towering mountains, another network, equally expansive and ancient, stretched across the vibrant waters of the Indian Ocean. These were the crucial maritime silk routes, intricately connecting ports from East Africa to India and from the Arabian Peninsula to Southeast Asia. Long before the traditional age of sail, skilled mariners were expertly navigating the powerful monsoon winds, traversing enormous distances, and effectively transforming the ocean into a thriving global marketplace. The fundamental key to it all lay in the predictable monsoon winds, reliable seasonal currents that predictably reversed their direction each half of the year. Ancient mariners learned to precisely time their journeys with these winds, heading east when they blew in from Africa and west when they reversed course. Armed with this invaluable knowledge, ships could reliably cross the open ocean, undertaking voyages that once seemed utterly impossible. Indian merchants sailed from the coasts of Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, exporting highly sought-after spices, fine textiles, precious gemstones, and valuable ivory. In return, they imported powerful horses, fragrant incense, gleaming gold, and even exotic animals. Arab traders from bustling ports like Aden and Oman transported goods to and from the Persian Gulf, while East African merchants in places like Rapta actively traded ivory and tortoise shell. Chinese vessels, particularly during the powerful Han and later Tang dynasties, also ventured into this intricate maritime network, exporting valuable silk, exquisite ceramics, and fine lacquerware. By the 1st century CE, Greek and Roman ships were regularly arriving in Indian ports like Baragaza and Maziris, completely bypassing the more arduous overland routes. A surviving Roman-era guidebook, The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, meticulously describes in detail the bustling trade ports, the diverse goods exchanged, and the precise routes followed by sailors across the Indian Ocean. This wasn't mere speculation. It was a practical manual for navigating global commerce. But the sea was more than just a place of trade. It also served as a vital highway for the exchange of ideas. Buddhism, for instance, spread from India to Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia primarily via these maritime routes. Islamic traders later carried their faith across the Indian Ocean, profoundly shaping entire coastal cultures in East Africa and the Malay world. Unlike the often militarized overland empires, the Indian Ocean Trade Network thrived on principles of pluralism and mutual cooperation. Ports became vibrant melting pots of diverse languages, religions, and cuisines. A Tamil merchant, a Swahili sailor, a Yemeni imam, and a Chinese diplomat could all conduct business in the same bustling harbor. In this ancient sea, the tides didn't just carry ships. They carried entire civilizations, connecting them in a grand, unseen current. Not all ancient travel was solely driven by trade, warfare, or imperial expansion. For millions, the most compelling reason to embark on a journey was profound faith. Sacred sites, holy rivers, and distant shrines drew countless pilgrims across continents, often at great personal cost, in search of healing, enlightenment, or divine favor. These were not mere recreational trips. They were demanding spiritual tests, acts of devotion set in motion. In ancient India, pilgrimage was absolutely central to both Hindu and Buddhist life. People traveled vast distances to bathe in the sacred Ganges River, visit revered shrines like Varanasi or Bodh Gaya, or climb high into the majestic Himalayas to seek out remote mountain hermitages. These arduous journeys, often long and perilous, were believed to cleanse karma and bring one closer to spiritual liberation. Buddhist monks journeyed not only within India but also beyond its borders, diligently spreading their faith along established trade routes into Sri Lanka, Central Asia, China, and even further. In Greece, pilgrims flocked to renowned oracles like Delphi, where the priestess of Apollo spoke in enigmatic riddles believed to reveal divine insight. Others visited healing sanctuaries such as Epidaurus, where offerings and specific rituals were performed in hopes of curing various ailments. These sacred journeys also served as significant social and economic events, with numerous vendors, entertainers, and civic ceremonies transforming pilgrimages into vibrant community affairs. In the Roman Empire, religion was intricately interwoven with state identity. Pilgrimages to prominent temples and imperial cult centers were both acts of deep piety and explicit political loyalty. Devotees might travel to the Temple of Asclepius for healing or undertake the journey to Jerusalem, then under Roman control, as part of established Jewish religious tradition, especially during major festivals like Passover. Pilgrimage was also a fundamental cornerstone of Zoroastrian and ancient Egyptian traditions. Ancient Persians traveled to sacred fire temples, while Egyptians undertook sacred journeys along the Nile to participate in significant temple festivals, such as those at Abydos, believed to be the burial place of the god Osiris. These sacred travels frequently blurred the lines between spiritual and political space. Roads were meticulously maintained not solely for armies or merchants, but also specifically for the faithful. Shrines often emerged along bustling trade routes, and temples frequently doubled as welcoming inns for weary pilgrims. As a direct result, pilgrimage played a crucial role in binding together vast regions through shared belief systems and common sacred geographies. Ultimately, these journeys were more than just physical movements. To travel in devotion was to symbolically shed one's ego, comforts, and worldly attachments, and then return profoundly transformed. The body journeyed across the land, but the soul embarked on a much deeper, internal expedition. By the time the ancient world gracefully transitioned into the medieval era, the fundamental foundations of global connectivity had already been firmly established, not solely by ambitious emperors, but by the countless brave travelers who dared to venture into the unknown. Merchants, devout pilgrims, intrepid explorers, and learned scholars had intricately woven together a vast, complex web of routes, both overland and maritime, sacred and commercial, peaceful and perilous. What they left behind was not just ephemeral footprints, but a lasting legacy of profound exchange, of valuable goods, transformative ideas, diverse faiths, and groundbreaking technologies that would continue to shape civilizations for many centuries to come. Travel profoundly changed everything. The widespread adoption of writing systems like the revolutionary Phoenician alphabet helped standardize communication across disparate borders. Major religious movements, Buddhism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and later Islam, all owe their global reach to the steady footsteps of wandering teachers and dedicated believers. Spices from distant India flavored the lavish feasts of Roman nobles. Exquisite Chinese silk adorned the robes of Parthian kings. African gold crossed the Red Sea and eventually found its way into Persian treasuries. But travel also fundamentally reshaped how people conceived of the world itself. Ancient geographers like Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, using little more than sun angles and pure logic. Strabo and Ptolemy meticulously mapped continents using second-hand reports and daring, often insightful assumptions. Even geographically inaccurate maps were crucial steps towards something much larger. A burgeoning vision of a connected Earth where distant peoples were no longer mere myths, but fellow human beings traversing different roads. These ancient roads, rivers, and sea lanes would eventually evolve into the great trade networks of the medieval and early modern worlds. The Silk Road would seamlessly merge into burgeoning Islamic caravan routes. Ancient Roman roads would be walked by Christian pilgrims for centuries. Indian Ocean sailing knowledge would be inherited and built upon by Arab, Chinese, and eventually European navigators. Perhaps most remarkably, the very spirit of ancient travel, this fundamental human urge to reach out beyond the familiar and known, still endures vividly within us. The modern world may be propelled by powerful engines and guided by precise GPS technology, but its enduring heart still beats with the same profound curiosity that drove intrepid Phoenician sailors, diligent Chinese caravanners, and insightful Egyptian emissaries thousands of years ago. They didn't possess passports, credit cards, or travel insurance, but they carried something far more valuable: immense boldness and a clear vision, alongside an unshakable belief that the world beyond the towering mountains, the vast dunes, or the crashing waves truly mattered. They believed that what lay beyond the horizon was inherently worth the risk. And because they held that powerful belief, we, their descendants, inherited a world tied together not solely by trade or conquest, but by the very essence of human movement itself.